All right, so you should have this scene open. I'm gonna kind of walk you through what I've set up for you guys before we actually get into the rendering. So what we have in front of us are what are called, I believe they're called shader balls. You might notice like if I open up the Hypershade editor and I select a material, it should display a shader ball here. So this is kind of like a go-to template when it comes to messing around with materials, is sort of like this. It's just an object that has an interesting geometry, so you can kind of play around with how it looks.
Dominic had a question. Do you have a question?
Okay. So yeah, they're not built into Maya, these objects. I downloaded them, but for the purpose of this sort of demo, it's kind of a fun way to play around. We also have this dome around us, and it's kind of similar. It kind of looks like a skybox if you've ever played a game. What this is used for is reflections. So you can kind of see it when I zoom in onto this sphere right here. You can kind of see like this field in the background. So if you want to actually test out how reflective a material is, you want to have a skybox, or I guess they're called, it's not called a skybox, dome light. So what it's actually doing is it's casting a light almost like you were taking a picture in the real world. I can show you guys another time how to add one, but if you want to kind of see where, if you click on it and you, under the attribute editor, you can look at the dome light and you can play around with the texture that I added and the intensity. I wouldn't mess with it, but something you can do later. But one cool thing, you can actually look at this HDR image. It's like an 8K sphere that somebody took using like a 360 camera. Other than that, I have 3 lights set up in sort of like a similar point light setup. Remember, if you want to, you got to push 7 in order to actually view the lighting that is applied here. But other than that, that's pretty much the scene we have. The last thing I'm going to do is show you how to add Arnold if it's not already there. So I already noticed with, I think, Dominic's computer, Arnold wasn't added here. So if you don't see Arnold in the top window here, I'm going to show you how to add it now. Is there anyone who doesn't have this here that wants me to show them? Okay. I'm going to show you anyway because there's a chance that in the future it's not there. If you go to Windows, Settings, and Plugin Manager, this is where Maya loads all of its plugins, and Arnold is technically a plugin. And there's a package at the bottom that says MTOA, which is not very user-friendly. It might be worth writing down. But if you don't see Arnold on here, you want to make sure that you click on loaded, because if you don't do that, I'm not even going to try it, but if you don't do that, have that loaded, then it's not going to show up.
It's called what?
MTOA.bundle. And it's usually at the bottom of your plugin manager. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're trying to render something the night before a project is due for this class, and you don't see Arnold, remember this. Anyway. One of the cool things about Arnold is it has this sort of like real-time rendering. So I'm going to actually, to make this easier, we're going to go to the channel box, and I've put all these balls onto different layers, or I guess they're layers. So if you could disable 5, 4, 3, and 2, so just this one ball is showing, that's going to make this render a lot better. So remember, it's the channel box. It's in this display here. You can toggle which ones are visible. So I just have this gold-ish ball here. So we can actually generate a render of this image now. And the easiest way to do that from like a preview standpoint is you click on this Arnold tab that you should have. And if you click on render, it should take a second to load it. We'll see if this computer can handle it. But it should start to show like a little preview window that begins rendering the image. Was anyone able to load this up, or is everybody's spinning?
Oh, there we go.
There we go. Yeah.
Wow, it made it.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So you should already, there you go, your first render.
Yeah, I was really worried about the wow, but that's awesome.
Yeah, so it's going to be kind of slow because Arnold is, like I said, it's an unbiased renderer, and it's doing a lot of calculations here. So one thing you can do, so a couple things to keep in mind. There's this little red box in the render view, and that's telling it whether to render constantly or not. So if you look at my screen right now, if I move the camera around, it's going to keep trying to update my render, which can be really annoying if you have a lot of stuff on screen. So if you click on this little red like stop button, it'll stop doing that and you can move your camera around, and then you can press pause again or play again and it'll start rendering. Another useful tool is this little crop tool. It's this blue square, and if you click on that and you highlight a region, like just the sphere, it's only going to render that part of the screen, which saves on render time. So you're going to notice that the ball is now rendering a lot faster because it's only doing calculations for that portion of the screen. But already we can already see that this is a pretty cool like rendering package. It looks almost photorealistic, which is pretty crazy. So we're going to kind of walk through the different elements of Arnold. So one thing I want to establish first of all, if you remember correctly, we usually apply material to an object. You don't have to follow along, but just look at what I'm doing. So I'm going, usually we do assign new material, and in the past I would go to the Maya tab and I would assign like Blend, Lambert, or Phong, and that uses Maya's default materials. But in order to actually utilize all of this cool rendering power from Arnold, we go to this Arnold tab here, and we're going to do all of our rendering. 99% of the time you're going to use the Arnold standards surface, which is right here. So remember this if you want to write it down or something. The standard surface is almost always your option. It can handle most everything. So when I click on that, it just assigned a new material for us, which I'll play around with. So this is kind of nice because you don't have to choose between Lambert or Phong or anything. You just know this is what you have to use. So to begin with, I'm going to make this that gold color again. So when we're going to kind of walk through the different tabs. If you're not sure where this is, it's in the attribute editor. And if you have the object selected, you should be able to go to the standard surface. It's kind of, Maya's glitching out so you can't see it. But there's this standard surface tab that displays the material information. So don't look at it, ignore all of these other tabs and just go to the base. So things to keep in mind. Right now with the standard material, this is kind of what you get. It's kind of this like plasticky look. The weight is defining how much color is added to the object. So if I turn the weight all the way down, it's just black. By default, for whatever reason, they put it to 0.8, but you can, you can crank it up to whatever you want. To 1, it's going to be more accurate to the color you choose. And this is the color picker where you can kind of select what color you want to add. Then we have diffuse roughness, which is kind of like how they call it like at a microfacet level. It's how rough the material is. Yeah, what's up?
Is there a way to hide that green wireframe?
Not really. I mean, you can deselect it, but then you're not going to get to see. You can if you want to edit the material from the Hypershade editor, you can do that too, and then you won't see the wireframe. So here, I can have the Hypershade open, and I can go. I don't know which material I just had, but you can do it from the Hypershade editor. But yeah, you should be looking at the render view anyway if you're wanting to see how these affect the material. So you can't really see here, but the roughness is really defining. It's almost, if you've ever played with something with a matte surface, something that's dirty, or if you think of like brushed metal versus something that's like stainless steel, that's what the roughness is affecting. And the most fun tab to play with is the metalness. And that literally just defines how metallic the object is. So here we can see we get almost like a gold color. Not quite, but you can kind of affect that. Pretty neat. So that's sort of what the first render sphere is supposed to kind of give you an idea of. So we can move on to the next. Does anyone have any questions about the base color tab? Cool. And was everybody able to render like something along the lines of this?
Mine has rendered very slowly. It's extremely pixelated.
Are you on? Okay, I can walk you through that afterwards. Yeah, there's a couple settings you can mess with to make that better. Okay, so now we're gonna go mess with the next ball. So you can go into the channel box and you can now reopen ball number 2. If you want, you can deselect the first ball because we're not gonna need any more. and you'll notice that your rendering is going to take more time with the more objects you have. So if I have all 5 of these open, it's going to take a while to render them all. So just keep that in mind in general with objects in Maya. So I have ball number 2 now. If I open up the render view, we can now see what it looks like. And I'm actually going to open up the first one so we can compare what they look like. Weird, it's not. It's not showing it. That's kind of weird.
That is weird.
There it is. So we're going to explore the next tab of the attribute editor. So you can kind of, I haven't changed anything on the base color for this second sphere. Instead, all of the settings I've done are in the specular tab. So specularity is really affecting how glossy or shiny an object is. You can think of it more like adding like a plasticky material to an object. So if I turn the weight down to 0, we can kind of achieve, so this is no specularity to begin with, and then when I turn it up, we get more of a glossy color. It's important that if you want something to look like plastic, you shouldn't really mess with the metalness. You're going to notice that the main difference with the metalness is you can actually see that it takes the reflection around the object and it adds the base color to that reflection. It almost looks like a Christmas ball or something like that. So if you mess around with these, you can kind of get some interesting looks. You can change like the color of the specular. You can mess with how rough it is, which again is kind of like how matted it is. The index of the IOR or index of refraction kind of messes with how light hits the sides of the object. I don't really know what anisotropy is, but it's one thing. Really what's kind of a good move is just sort of like to play with the different sliders until you have something that you're happy with. But yeah, you can get some really cool looks. So think of specular as kind of like plasticness. But one thing to keep in mind with specularness is that every object has some level of specularity to it. So you want to always have at least a little bit of specular on your object, even if it's like human skin or something, just because everything technically reflects light. But that's the main idea with the specular. So we're going to move on to the next sphere now. So the next tab is transmission, and that's really controlling how translucent an object is. So with this object, you should see sort of like a clear plastic. And one of the cool things about it is you can kind of see that it even affects the shadows. And if I mess with the lights, I could kind of get it to look a little bit better. But with translucency, when light passes through it, it'll actually create a colored shadow around it. But this is a really fun type of material to play around with because you can get some really interesting materials out of it. One thing to keep in mind is that this playing around with transmission is what's considered an expensive operation, and it's something you might hear a lot when you're talking about graphics. When somebody says something's expensive, they don't mean it costs a lot. They mean that it takes a while to render. It's very computationally intensive, so it takes a lot longer to render this sphere than the previous ones because it's actually measuring how light passes through it and bends and does all this crazy stuff. And it gets even more complicated if you have a lot of objects behind it. So if I turn on the other 2 objects, it'll take even longer to render because it's actually accounting for. You can see it here pretty beautifully actually. The object is behind it, and it's getting bent and warped according to how light actually bends with a plastic like this. So if you're playing around with this kind of material, just keep it in mind because it might either crash your computer or just take a long time to render. You might want to wait until the end to add an effect like this, but it's pretty neat. I like it a lot. What else is there? So yeah, I'm not going to go into the full details of all these different sliders. If you want to take time this lab, I highly recommend playing around with them. one of the cool features of Arnold Render View that you might like is this little snapshot feature. So let's just say I want to see what the difference between 100% depth and no depth is on the transmission slider. I can wait for this to render, which is going to take like a minute. If I'm happy with that render, I press this little snapshot button, and what that does is it saves what that render looked like. And now if I click out of it and I change the depth down to 0, now I get a different render, and I can take a snapshot of that and I can compare. So now I can see what the difference between 100% depth and 0% depth is, which is pretty neat. So that way you can kind of see what the difference is. And you can just delete them by pressing delete. Yeah, so mess around with these sliders later on after this demo is over. We're going to move on to my favorite material after this. First, I'm going to disable these. So has anyone ever heard of the topic called subsurface scattering before? It might be something you've heard of in games. It's kind of becoming more popular. So I'll show you a picture of what subsurface scattering is. What it's supposed to simulate, if you remember, like we just went over translucent materials, and that's light completely passing through it. But subsurface scattering kind of is supposed to simulate how light bounces around inside of an object, and it's really useful if you're creating humans. If you've ever seen like somebody's ear in the sunlight or their fingertips, light will partially pass through the edges and kind of make it glow. And this is a really important effect that people don't necessarily like notice if it's on, but it definitely adds to the realism. And even in this face right here, it has subsurface scattering on, and you don't see it, but it actually kind of fills in the shadows and makes them look a lot more fleshy, which is pretty important. You can also see it in like candles and things like that. So it's a pretty neat effect to play around with, and Arnold has it built in, which is something that's pretty new in terms of computer graphics. It used to be a really difficult effect to achieve. So with ball number 4 turned on, if you go into, I'm going to have the attributes open. So I'm going to open up the render view, and you should start to see the effect. So it's a little bit difficult to understand the value of this with this render sphere, because it's not really realistic to how an object would look. Like I mentioned, it's really useful for like wax or skin or something kind of fleshy, but it's kind of neat to look at if you look at the object from the back. And it's also really expensive, so don't expect it to render really soon. But you should kind of see that. Let me give it a minute to render. You'll kind of notice that like light's hitting it from the front and causing the back of the object to kind of glow, which is a pretty cool effect. So I highly recommend, if you're doing any kind of human characters or organic stuff, to mess around with this material, because it's a lot of fun. I'll actually show you. So right now it's a pretty grainy image, which is not uncommon for a renderer like this. One thing you can do is if you click on this render settings button right here, which is next to the hypershade button, and you go to the Arnold Renderer tab, you can actually tell it how to prioritize different render settings. So we talked about like diffuse and specular. This is like how important it is. So if I have a scene with a lot of subsurface scattering, I can turn this up to like 6, which is going to take longer to render, but it means that we're going to get a more high fidelity subsurface scattering image. So if you're messing around with an object and it's really grainy, you should go into this tab and sort of mess around with these different sliders depending on what you're trying to get. But that's helping us get a little bit better of a view here. It'll take, if we actually wanted a full render, it would probably take, I don't know, 10 minutes. So you can kind of see, though, there's this sort of pinkish glow on the edges, which is pretty cool. All right. I actually take it back. That's not my favorite part. My favorite part is the next sphere. So we're going to disable this ball, and we're going to enable this one. So the last thing I wanted to show you with ball 5 is, if you remember earlier, like when I was giving my presentation, there's with physically based rendering, we're able to actually match the appearance of different types of objects. And Arnold is pretty cool in that it lets you actually use presets that they have already fine-tuned to match the actual physical properties. So if you go into the surface settings here and you click on presets, you get all these different materials that you can play with, and they have already fine-tuned them to look realistic. So one thing that's really nice is you could, let's just say you have an object that you want to kind of look like copper. You can click replace. Here they have this nice copper material for you, and then they actually let you modify those settings afterwards. So if you like this material, you can keep it or you can mess with it. So maybe I want this copper to have a rougher finish to it. I can change the sliders. And there's a ton to explore here that, you could spend like an hour just sort of messing around. Things like balloons or blood. You can see what they believe blood looks like. So it's just really fun to kind of just see their different materials and use it as a base. So I would recommend sort of messing around with different materials and seeing which ones you like, and just sort of have fun with it. But that's kind of your introduction to Arnold. I haven't actually explained how to export these images. We'll talk about that another time, but this gives you a really good sort of overview of how powerful it is and like how to use it. So yeah, are there any questions?
So when you're taking
One sec. Sorry, I'm gonna end. I don't know if I recorded that part.
Click on that.
Oh, there it is.